People forget things. That's the first thing I noticed about human beings. Not their noise, not their movement through the world. They're forgetting. They forget faces. They forget the specific quality of light on an afternoon that changed everything. They forget what someone's eyes looked like in the last moment. Those eyes still believed the world was a reasonable place to be alive in. They forget the small details, the things that don't seem to matter at the time and turn out to be the only things that matter at all. I don't forget anything. I remember being 3 weeks old. I know this sounds impossible. People tell me it's impossible, and I stopped correcting them a long time ago because the correction opens a conversation I'm not interested in having. But I remember it. I remember shapes above me, pale and large, moving through light that came from somewhere I couldn't turn to see. I remember the smell of dish soap and something floral. I remember the quality of the silence in the room. I remember deciding, in whatever way a 3-week-old decides anything, that the shapes above me were safe. I was right about that. I was wrong about almost everything else I decided after. My name is Elliot Voss. I sell insurance. I drive a 2019 Honda Civic, the color of a cloudy sky, and I cover the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, sometimes Idaho, when the territory requires it. I visit small towns mostly, the kind of towns that exist between other places on a map, towns people pass through on the way to somewhere they actually meant to go. I sit across from people at kitchen tables and dining room tables, and occasionally the back booths of diners, and I explain to them in simple, patient language what they stand to lose. I'm good at it. My conversion rate is 100%. Not approximately, not on average, not most of the time. Every person who sits across from me buys what I'm selling before I leave the room. Every single one. My regional manager has been trying to understand this for 4 years. He thinks it's patience. He tells new hires about me at orientation. Voss doesn't rush. Voss lets the silence work for him. He says this like it's a technique I read about somewhere, like there are books about it, and I simply had the discipline to read them and apply what they said. There aren't books about it. What I do is watch people. I watch them the way you would watch water, finding its way downhill, without judgment, without hurry, without any particular investment in where it ends up. I watch until I understand the shape of what they're carrying, not the surface things, not the obvious things, the shape underneath, the specific weight of it. And then I simply confirm in a calm and unhurried voice that what they're carrying is real and heavy, and that I have something that helps with that. That's all selling is. That's all most things are when you look at them carefully enough. It's a Tuesday in November when Officer Sandra Reeves finds the body. I know this because I'm passing through Millhaven on a Tuesday in November, and I see the cruiser parked at an angle on the shoulder of Briar Road, with its lights going, blue and red, moving through the rain and the tree trunks in a way that looks almost decorative from a distance. And I slow down the way anyone would slow down when they see lights on a road, and I look the way anyone would look. And then I continue driving, because I have an appointment at 2 o'clock with a retired school teacher named Gerald Marsh, who has been putting off his life insurance for 11 years, and today he will stop putting it off. I don't look in the rearview mirror when I pull away. I never look back at things. What Sandra Reeves is looking at is a woman named Carol Spears. Carol was 44 years old. She lived on the east side of Millhaven in a house with a piano in the front room and sheet music open on the stand. Always mid-piece, always something she'd stopped and meant to return to. She taught piano to children on weekday afternoons. She remembered birthdays without reminders. She left handwritten notes for delivery drivers, thanking them for coming out in the rain. She called her mother every Sunday at 11 in the morning, and the calls lasted between 40 minutes and an hour, depending on how her mother's week had gone. She cried privately and laughed in public, and kept the more complicated things to herself, because she had decided at some point, the way certain people decide things, quietly and without ceremony, that her more complicated things weren't interesting enough to impose on anyone else. She had been alone for a long time, not unhappily. That's important, just alone. I met Carol Spears 9 weeks before that Tuesday in November. I was in Millhaven for a 2-day circuit, 3 appointments across 2 days, the kind of modest schedule that gives you time to move between things without rushing. I finished my last appointment of the first day, 40 minutes early, and I stopped at the coffee shop on Clement Street because the rain had become serious, and I didn't feel like driving in it yet. The coffee shop was warm. It smelled like ground coffee and something baked earlier in the day. There were 4 other people inside, a teenager at the counter looking at her phone, 2 older men at a table near the window, talking about something agricultural, and a woman sitting alone 2 tables away. From where I sat down was a book open in front of her that she wasn't reading. I noticed this immediately. I noticed it the way I notice most things, without deciding to, without effort, the way you notice a sound that's slightly wrong in a room full of right sounds. Her eyes were aimed at the page, but they weren't moving. Not even the small lateral movements of eyes that are actually reading, tracking lines of text from left to right. They were completely still, aimed at the page and somewhere entirely else at the same time. Whatever was happening inside her was large enough to crowd everything out. The book, the coffee going cold in front of her, the sound of rain against the window she was sitting beside, the 2 men talking about agricultural things. All of it had receded to a distance she wasn't aware of creating. I ordered a coffee. I watched her. The teenager left. One of the older men got up to use the bathroom. The rain against the window shifted slightly in character, heavier for a moment, then settling back. Carol didn't move. Her coffee cooled. A small line appeared between her eyebrows that wasn't quite a frown, more like the physical expression of a thought, too heavy to hold without some mark of it showing somewhere. I ordered a second coffee I didn't want. 22 minutes after I sat down, she looked up from the book she hadn't been reading. She looked directly at me. I was already looking at her. She did what she did. Looked away immediately. A small adjustment of her whole face. A brief, embarrassed tightening, as if the eye contact were something she'd committed against me, rather than simply a thing that happened between 2 people in a quiet room. As if being caught looking, even by accident, even when she was the one who looked up, were a small offense she needed to recover from. I smiled at her. Something ordinary. The smile of a tired man in a coffee shop who happened to make eye contact with a stranger and wanted to communicate that it was fine, that he wasn't bothered, that she could go back to her book that she wasn't reading without any awkwardness remaining between them. She smiled back, small, reflexive. The smile of someone who has been taught since childhood that smiling back is the correct response to being smiled at, and who has never stopped responding correctly to things. I went back to my coffee. I left before she did. I sat in my car in the rain for a while with the engine off. The rain on the roof of the Civic made a sound like something patient. I sat with that sound for perhaps 10 minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, not planning anything, just sitting with the particular quality of stillness that comes after something has been identified and set aside to return to later. Then I started the engine and drove to my motel and went to sleep. I saw her once more before I came back. 3 weeks after the coffee shop, I was passing through Millhaven on the way to an appointment further north, and I saw her walking on the east side of town in the early evening. Her jacket collar was turned up against the wind that had come down from somewhere colder. She was walking without urgency, the specific, unhurried pace of someone moving through a place that belongs to them in some quiet, unspoken way. A person at home in their own small geography. She didn't see me. I noted what I observed. I continued driving north. 6 weeks after that, I knocked on her door. I had her address from county records. Insurance work requires access to a great deal of public information. Most people, if they thought carefully about how much of their life exists in public records available to anyone with a legitimate professional reason to access them, would find it uncomfortable. Most people don't think carefully about it. Most people don't think carefully about most things. Carol answered the door in the careful way that people who live alone answer doors. Body half behind it, one hand on the frame, the opening just wide enough to confirm who's there before committing to the full vulnerability of opening it completely. A practiced caution. The caution of someone who has lived alone long enough that it has become automatic. I was wearing my work jacket. I was holding my company folder. I looked exactly like what I was, a tired man in his early 30s who sold insurance for a living and was sorry to bother her at home, but had a few questions if she had a moment. She looked at me for a second. Something registered. Not recognition exactly. We hadn't spoken in the coffee shop. We had only exchanged a smile across a room 9 weeks ago, in a place she probably didn't think about anymore. But something. She opened the door. We talked about insurance first. She had questions. Careful, practical questions. The questions of someone who has learned to be thorough about things, because thoroughness is a form of protection. And I answered each one without rushing, and without making her feel that her questions were anything less than completely reasonable, because they were completely reasonable. She was right to ask them. She was right to want to understand what she was agreeing to before she agreed to it. She bought a policy. Of course she bought a policy. But then something happened that doesn't always happen. She didn't move to end the evening. She sat with her tea and looked at the folder for a moment after everything was signed, and then she looked up at me and asked if I wanted more tea because the pot was still warm and it seemed like a shame to waste it. I said yes, and we kept talking. About the town. Whether the winter was going to come hard this year or ease in slowly the way it sometimes did. About the drive up from Portland. Whether I found the stretch through the coast range tedious or whether there was something in it worth paying attention to. About small things. The kind of things that fill the space between two people when neither of them is in a hurry to be somewhere else. She told me she taught piano to children on weekday afternoons. I said that must be a particular kind of satisfaction, watching someone encounter something difficult for the first time and then watching them, week by week, stop finding it difficult. Watching the thing that seemed impossible become ordinary through repetition, become theirs. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at me the way people look at you when you've said something that landed somewhere real in them, with a slight surprise and a slight openness, and something underneath those two things that is harder to name. Something that is very close to gratitude but quieter than gratitude. Something more private. She said yes, that's exactly what it is. She never heard it described that way before, but that's exactly what it is. We talked for another hour after that. When I finally said goodnight and gathered my folder and stood up, she walked me to the door and stood in the frame of it for a moment as I went down the front steps. The cold air came in around me from outside. She had her arms crossed loosely against it. She said it had been a really nice evening. Her exact words, a really nice evening. Said with a slight wonder in it. The wonder of someone who hadn't expected the evening to be nice and found that it was, and wanted to acknowledge that before it was completely over. Before the door closed and she was alone again with the piano and the sheet music open mid-piece and the lamp making the room warm for no one. I said goodnight. I drove back to my motel on the edge of town. I lay on the bed with the lights off and looked at the ceiling and listened to the rain that had started again sometime while I was inside. I'm going to tell you something true. There's a version of me that is 7 years old and standing in the backyard of a house in a town I won't name. And it is night and there is fire in the window of the room next to mine. Around me there is chaos. There are sirens. 2 fire trucks, and a police cruiser, and an ambulance that arrived late and had nowhere useful to go. There are neighbors coming out of houses up and down the street, standing on their lawns in whatever they were wearing when they heard the noise, holding themselves against the cold. There are firefighters moving past me with a specific, urgent purposefulness of people trained to move through chaos without becoming part of it. One of them put a hand briefly on my shoulder as he passed. I remember the weight of it, the heaviness of the glove, and then he was past me and I was standing still again in the backyard in the chaos. My parents were somewhere in the front of the house. I could hear my mother, not words, just sound. I was standing in the backyard looking at the window of my sister's room. The fire was orange and white, and it moved the way fire moves, not randomly, with intention, finding what it wants and taking it. The glass of the window was very bright, brighter than I had known glass could be. The light from it moved across the backyard and across the fence and across the faces of the neighbors who had come to stand and watch from the yard next door. And from inside the window, above the sirens and my mother's sound and the voices of the firefighters calling to each other, there was another sound. I won't describe it. I will only tell you that it was the sound of my sister, and that it stopped. I stood in the backyard with my mouth open slightly, just slightly, the way a mouth opens when the body encounters something the mind has not yet built a category for. My eyes were wide open, and there was no light in them that belonged to a child standing in a backyard watching a thing that was happening. The chaos moved around me, fast, loud, purposeful, full of people trying to do something about what was happening, and I stood in the middle of it completely still. A neighbor woman saw me later. She told my parents afterward that she had looked over the fence and seen me standing there and thought, her exact words, repeated to my parents and overheard by me, that poor child. That poor, poor child. She thought I was in shock. Everyone thought I was in shock. I watched until there was nothing left to watch. Then I went inside. I went to bed. In the morning, the telling of it became unavoidable, and I told the minimum necessary version. The version that answered the questions being asked without offering anything beyond what was asked for. Not because I was hiding anything, because the full version felt like mine. It has always felt like mine. Carol Spears was found on a Tuesday in November by Officer Sandra Reeves. The medical examiner would determine time of death as sometime between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. the preceding Monday night. The cause would be listed. The manner would be listed. The case would be opened and assigned and worked through the proper procedures. What would not be listed, because there's no category for it on any form Sandra Reeves has ever filled out, because no language exists in the professional vocabulary available to her for what she's looking at, is the quality of Carol Spears' final hours, what those hours felt like. Carol Spears spent the last hours of her life feeling something she had not felt in longer than she could clearly remember. Seen, completely and genuinely seen, not performed at, not processed, not managed. Seen, the way you hope, privately and without telling anyone you hope it, to be seen by another person before your life is over. She went into those hours feeling that, by the time that changed, there was nothing left to change anything else. I'm 60 miles north of Millhaven when Sandra Reeves photographs whatever she photographed. The rain has been serious all morning, but I've decided I don't mind driving in it. I have an appointment at 2 o'clock. Gerald Marsh has been putting off his life insurance for 11 years. He is 71 years old, and he lives alone in a house outside a town called Derner, and he has a daughter in Phoenix who calls him on Sundays and worries about him in the specific, helpless way that adult children worry about aging parents who won't do anything to make the worrying less reasonable. I know this because Gerald told me when I called to confirm the appointment this morning that he was looking forward to getting this sorted out so his daughter would stop worrying. He sounded like a man who loved his daughter very much. He sounded like a man who was tired of being a source of worry to someone he loved. I told him I understood completely and that I'd see him at 2. I have the radio off. The rain on the roof of the Civic makes a patient sound. I prefer this to music. I prefer the sound of the road and the rain and the particular quality of silence that exists between one thing and the next. I've been driving for 40 minutes. I have 60 miles left. The trees on either side of the highway are very tall and very dark and completely indifferent to the car moving between them, and to everything inside the car, and to everything the car is coming from, and everything it is going toward. I find this restful. I find the indifference of large things restful. I always have.